Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Anybody out there? Okay, that's better. You know, Penny and we haven't had a Rooker vacation in, I can't even remember the last time, but we're going to be going on a little vacation this coming week, and we're driving up to upstate New York. Now, not New York City. We're not that brave or that stupid, but it's upstate New York, and it should be we've been there before. It's very nice this time of the year. So we're driving up there, and as long as it'll take us to get there, we'll get there, and we'll probably have to say, well, we're here. It's time to turn around and go home now. But actually, no, we'll stay up there for a few days. So anyway, we're looking forward to that. I probably told you this, I got to get a new watch. I was telling you, coming to church today, I've lost my watch. Doesn't work, but there's a clock, so I'll finish on time. I was going to give a sermon today. I gave a sermon I gave in Birmingham last week. I'm going to pare it down a little bit for a split sermon, but I think that shouldn't be a problem. But I don't remember how many of you may remember this far back. Some of you weren't even born then. But in 1985, now there was a lot of, the country of Lebanon was a very dangerous place back then. There were all types of terrorism going on, and all types of kidnappings and all types of various things. There was an American journalist. His name was Terry Anderson. Now, I remember this date. I don't remember the date per se. I'm reading the date, but it was March 16th, 1985. And I was living in California then. The reason I remember 85 so clearly because I moved to Nashville later that year. But this Terry Anderson was American journalist. I believe he worked for the Associated Press, and he was kidnapped right out of his car. He was in a car in Beirut. He was kidnapped and held hostage for 2,454 days. Now, that's almost 7 years. Now, think about how, remember a lot of the Americans in Iran were kidnapped, and they were over there for a long, long time, too. But this Terry Anderson, it was a big deal in the news at the time, and I'm going to read a little bit here. On the first day of his confinement, his abductors, it was some Islamic terrorists, they held him at gunpoint. They took him out of the car he was in. They drove him blindfolded, and they chained him to a cot. They put him in this little apartment. And for the first 24 days, he was in chains, and he was bound, he was restrained. And the point is, he wrote a book later. The name of the book was Den of Lions. He wrote it in 1993, a year or so after he was released. But he was trying to maintain his sanity, because can you just imagine, you're in a foreign country, you're blindfolded, you're chained, you don't know what's going to happen. And he got to thinking, and I'll just read a few words here, a couple paragraphs or three. It said in his memoirs, he said, as he was just trying to figure out what to do, he wasn't a particular religious person, but he asked for a Bible. Now, that may be a kind of a dangerous thing to ask for a Bible when you're held by Islamic terrorists, who go by the Quran. But he said he asked his English-speaking guard if he could get a Bible. And he said the next day, late in the afternoon, reading here, the English-speaking guard came in, threw a heavy object on the bed. Now, he was still chained, he was still blindfolded, but he said he reached for it, he felt the smooth covers of the book, and the guard came over to the head of the bed, and he said, "Good?" And Anderson said, "Yes, very good, thank you." So he said, "I cautiously pulled my blindfold up a bit till I could see the book," and the book was a Bible. And it was actually a copy of the Revised Standard Version, which is one of the more familiar versions. He said, "I caressed it gently. I read the title page, the publishing. He said, I read the copyright. I read the introduction. I read all the notes from the editor slowly. And then I got to something that said Genesis, and the first three words was in the beginning. Now, how often do men and women, when they're in a real bad situation, and oftentimes they don't think a whole lot about God or the Bible until they're in a real tight spot, how often do they then sort of turn to the Bible a little bit? And that's what this Terry Anderson did. He later ran for, I don't know if it was Senate or Congress. Anyway, he lost, but he wrote that book. Now, I want to talk today about truth. Truth. If you want a title, it's a one-word title, truth. Because, there is truth in this world. Of course, the Bible is true, the truth. But do you get the truth every time you turn on the TV and look at the news? Where you get all types of various opinions like Ron Davenport was talking about. They can't all be right, can they? They can't all be right. And I remember my parents used to say, well, all these churches, as long as you're not Catholic or Jewish, you're okay. Now, that was their opinion. They said some other things. I had good parents, but that was one thing I thought, yeah, you think that's bad. Wait, they found out I was going to church on Saturday. Wasn't a pretty picture. I still have a living Bible they gave me that Christmas, trying to get me back. But since they're, probably shouldn't say this. I started to say since they're both dead, they can't do anything. But I'll see them again someday. They were very good people. Penny, you loved my mother, didn't you? Thinking, well, why didn't you love my father? Well, he died earlier than my mother. But there is all kind of falseness out there. It is rampant. Sure, you'd agree with that. Now, let's turn over to John chapter 18. Here's Jesus Christ at the when he was arrested, about to be crucified, and he's talking to Pilate. Now, these are some famous words here, very, very famous words. But he was talking to Pilate, and in chapter 18, and I'm breaking into a section here, but I just want to read a couple of verses. So Pilate, verse 37 and 38 of John 18. Pilate said to him, "Are you a king then? Are you a king?" to Jesus. Jesus said, "You say rightly that I'm a king. For this cause I was born. And for this cause I've come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth." To the truth. Everything Jesus Christ ever said has always been the truth. And everyone, that I should bear witness to the truth, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice, said Jesus to Pilate. Pilate was not a religious man. Pilate probably thought, what's he talking about? We don't know what Pilate was thinking, but he doesn't go down in history as that good a person. Now, when he said that, Pilate looked at him and he said, "What's truth?" Now, isn't that what you hear today? You got all these ideas and all these situations. It's quite frankly, it's pretty pathetic, is it not? So he said, "What's truth?" And when he said that, he just went out again to the people, and he said, "I don't find any fault in him." And then, of course, as you know, they clamored for him to be crucified. So I asked the question, what's truth? Now, are you going to find, and I think I said this, but, I could just out of the blue I could go to some big newsstand and buy 5 newspapers and that contradict each other. They would contradict because somebody says one thing, somebody says something else. If you really want consistency, you have to take CNN and MSNBC together. You may actually get consistency, but it's not truth a lot of times. They tend to say the same thing. But no matter where you turn, not just talking about them, anywhere you turn, you get all types of various ideas. Now, I remember years ago, and it was around 1990, and there was a Feast of Tabernacles in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I had been asked to we decided we were going to have a situation that year at Family Day where we were going to try to find out who the smartest person about as far as the Bible that was attending the feast that year. So what we did, I was told to put together. Okay, we had 3 tests, and the whole family day, and there were a lot of people attending church back then. The whole family day, people would come into this booth we had and take this Bible test. Now, the first Bible test, now I made it out, so obviously I knew the answers, but the first were supposed to be very simple Bible questions. Very simple. And I'm not exaggerating when I say questions like, they're all multiple choice, and it would say, and I think this is one of the questions, which of these is not one of the Gospels? You say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and say Malachi. Simple, you know that. If you say Malachi, you may need a little study there, but you know what I'm saying. So the point was, we were going to see if you could get 7 out of those 10 questions right, you would go to the next set of questions, which were harder. And then if you get 7 of that second section, you would go to the third and final section of 10 questions, which were very hard questions. And I found out something that was very shocking to me. And, none of us are going to win any awards for being geniuses, of knowing the most, of this, that, and the other thing. But I found there were hundreds of people took those tests that day at the Feast of Tabernacles and Family Days at Raccoon Mountain in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And of those that took the test, over half could not get 7 out of the first 10. I was shocked that they could not get 7 out of the first 10 questions. Now, in retrospect, in hindsight, you look back at it and you could see why we had some of the issues we probably ran into. But then the second set of questions, interestingly enough, most that could do get through the first 7, got through the second and got at least 7 out of 10 right in the second section. And then you went to the third, and like I said, it was really hard, the third. Now, we did that all day, and the award for winning was going to be a Bible. And I'll always remember this. Out of all these people that took the test, it was a man that did the best, was blind. A blind man got the highest score, which tells me, obviously, he can tell you a lot of things, but, he had to concentrate in certain ways. And so that's what was very striking to me. But it's just amazing how little people know about the Bible in this world. And we may think we're not the smartest, because none of us are, but yet we know so much more than the average person. Now, I'm going to read something here from this is from the Religious Literacy, a book called Religious Literacy: What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't. The man's name was Stephen Bartholomew, and he was the chairman of the religion department of Boston University. And this book talked about how little so many Americans knew about the Bible. And I just have like 4 things here I have printed off. This is Americans now. Half of adult Americans could not name even one of the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And yet, disappointingly, at that family day, over half of those that took the test couldn't, they would get confused and miss that. Now, a lot of them would get that right and miss some other questions, but I thought, well, how in the world do they not know that? I remember one time when I was living in California, we had a graduate club, a spokesman's club, and then we had a graduate club, and the minister the pastor there had us, each man, he assigned each of us a television preacher to watch on Sunday morning for a month. We're supposed to watch him 4 weeks in a row. And the one I got was pretty boring. I don't even remember his name anymore. But some of them got some real doozies, like Ernest Angley. Remember Ernest Angley and Jimmy Swaggart and some of the others. And it's amazing what passes for the truth, because these men get a lot of money sometimes of people sending in money. But half of adults in the United States could not even name one of the 4 Gospels. Most Americans, now it didn't have a percent, but over 50% of Americans, if you ask them what is the first book in the Bible, they didn't know it was Genesis. They didn't know it was Genesis. And even the definition of Genesis in Hebrew means beginning. Over 66% of Americans could not tell, the survey, who gave the Sermon on the Mount. They didn't know it was Jesus. Some of them, over 2/3 of them, didn't know Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. Most, and this one, I can see this one will be a little trickier. It said most think the Bible says Jesus was born in Jerusalem. Now, of course, he's born in Bethlehem, but most Americans thought he was born in Jerusalem. And then finally, 1 in 10, this is not a joke, 1 in 10 believe Joan of Arc was Noah's wife. Now, yeah, it's humorous, isn't it? Yes. It's humorous. Truth is just falling in the street. Remember that scripture says truth is falling in the street? It's pretty sad. It's pretty sad. Now, I have a quote here. Man, I'm already 15 minutes in my... I won't finish on time. You'll get sick of hearing me anyway over the years. But Irenaeus of Lyon, now he was what they call one of the early church fathers, and he certainly, there's things he didn't know about the truth, but he did make a statement. I've always liked this statement that he wrote. He said, error, this is a quote, never shows itself in its naked reality in order not to be discovered. On the contrary, it dresses elegantly. This is error. It dresses elegantly so that the unwary may be led to believe that error is more truthful than truth itself. I have some good friends that are, this is recorded, so what are you supposed to do? But I have some good friends that are Catholic. But what do they have right? They believe in Jesus, and they have some things right, but look at all the stuff they've got that's just so false. And like I said, my parents, when I started attending the Church of God, they were really worried about me. Really worried about me. We live in a crazy, weird place. A crazy, weird place in this world today, and times are getting harder. And as they get harder, you'll see the truth stamped on more and more. And Christians, even nominal Christians, even men and women, some that are very, very sincere and quite frankly put us to shame sometimes in their morals. There's some people I know that have tremendous morals. I remember a boss I used to have went to work for this company, the only couple companies I ever worked for, but I went to work for him, and I'd known him before, but they had our first sales meeting we had we're all around, and it was time for lunch. We're all getting ready. They'd brought in food, and I remember my boss said, I don't want to offend anybody, but if I do, too bad. I'm going to say a prayer before we eat. I was so impressed by that, that he actually said a prayer before he ate. So let's face it, it's a tough situation out there, and we have to fight it every day. And as times get harder, a lot of these people that'll call themselves, they'll say, they believe in God or they do this, and sometimes their actions belie the point of what they really say they believe. Now, I can tell you the first sin, and I'm not going to turn there because you all know it, Genesis 3, when Satan lied to Eve. And remember, Eve said, oh, we're not supposed to eat of that tree in the midst of the garden. We can eat of every tree in the garden except that tree in the midst of the garden, because God said when you eat of that tree, it said don't even touch it, because if you do, you'll die. And Satan, the serpent, said, you're not going to die. You're not going to die. And he said, when you eat of that tree, you're going to know good from evil. You're going to be just like God. And that's what has happened. Men and women have gotten to the point, and we're affected by it because we all live in the world, and we're out there, none of us could ever possibly hope to earn our salvation because we're not good enough. Without God's mercy, without God's grace, God is just incredibly merciful to all mankind, and He knows what we're all going through. But yet, Satan said, you're not going to lie. You're not going to die. You're going to be just like God. What a lie. And I could turn to the very last chapter of the Bible. In fact, I will. Genesis. Hey, I'm glad I didn't take that test, aren't you? Revelation. Yeah, I thought that test was easy because I made it out. That's pretty good. Probably would have missed one or two if I even took it after I made it out. But anyway, Genesis 22, right at the very end, my Bible has a little heading. It says a warning. It says verse 18 and 19 of Revelation 22, for I testify to everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. Now he's talking about Revelation, but he's also talking about, you could say, the entire Bible. Everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book, if anyone adds to these things, God will add to him or her the plagues that are written in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his or her part from the book of life, from the holy city, and from the things that are written in this book. So what God's saying, don't mess with the truth. I remember one of the first times I can ever remember my daughter, and I've got good kids. I got a daughter and a son. They both are good kids, or they're adults now, and they both go to church. But one of them, my daughter, when she's like 13 or 14, and we're all going. It was on trumpets, before trumpets. It was the night, trumpet starts at sunset, and it was like a couple hours before sunset or so. Met family for dinner at Outback Steakhouse. I remember that so clearly, and in Brentwood, Tennessee. And she wasn't feeling good, so she said could she just stay back at the house. And it's the first time I remember just leaving her alone. And I locked the door and I said, do not answer the phone if anyone calls. And after a while, when I was at the restaurant, I thought maybe I'll call her. Kind of know where this is going, don't you? And the line was busy. I thought, oh, this is interesting. So I waited another 5 or 10 minutes. I called her again, and the line was still busy. So I knew either she was on the phone or somehow the phone just fell off the hook magically. And when I got home, I brought this to her attention. And first she lied to me. Then after a minute she realized, can't get away from him, he's too mean. I better try to cut my losses here. But she just lied to me. And I thought, man, my daughter just lied to me. But today people don't think anything about lying. It's crazy in a way. So the Bible begins and ends talking about truth and untruth. Now, I've got 3 points, and I won't belabor them long, but 3 points for us to think about truth, because we're going to be dealing with this the rest of our lives as our country begins to deteriorate, as more and more situations get very, very frightening. We got to know what we believe. We got to know what we believe, and we got to know what God tells us. And yet, hey, I don't want to go through persecution. I don't want to go, but yet we know that God can protect us from anything, and God will protect His people. But yet we have to stand up for what we know, we believe, what is right. But first, we got to know what we believe, and what we believe's got to be right. Does it not? So the first point I have here is truth is not an emotion. Now, the truth is very emotional. You know, nothing is more emotional than knowing the truth. Nothing's more emotional than the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, when you're thinking about what it all represents and all these different things. So truth is very emotion, but just because it's emotional doesn't make it true. Doesn't make it true. When they had us, our pastor have us look at those ministers for 4 weeks on Sunday morning, and some of them got very emotional. As I said, my guy was so boring, I don't even remember his name, but yet I watched him for 4 weeks, and yet I could see, and what our point was, he wanted us to see where the things they did or said that wasn't true from the Bible. And yet it was a good lesson, I felt. So, truth is not just an emotion. Let's turn to 1 Kings. 1 Kings. 1 Kings 18. You know the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Now, verse 20, I'm not going to read it all, but verse 20 in 1 Kings 18, Ahab sent all the children of Israel, and they gathered the prophets together on Mount Carmel. Now, Ahab was one of the worst kings. He was the king that his wife's name was Jezebel. And Elijah came to all the people, all the Israelites, because they were going back and forth between the true God and Baal. And Elijah came to all the people and said, how long are you going to falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. And notice, the people didn't say a word. Didn't say a word. Then Elijah said to the people, I alone am left of the prophet of the Lord, of the eternal God. But Baal's prophets are 450 men. Therefore, let us give them 2 bulls, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, cut it in pieces, lay it on the wood, but don't put any fire under it. And I'm going to prepare the other bull, and I'm going to lay it on the wood, and don't put any fire under it either. Then you call on the name of the Lord your gods, prophets of Baal, and I'll call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers with fire, he is God. And then all the people answered and said, good, well spoken. Well, you know the story, but let me just read here a few more verses. Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, you choose 1 bull for yourselves, prepare it first for your many, and call on the name of your God, but don't put any fire in it. So they took this bull that was given them. They prepared it, and they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon, a few hours there. Baal, oh Baal, hear us, they said. But there was no voice. No one answered. So they leaped about the altar which they had made, getting real emotional here. So it was at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, cry aloud, he's a god, isn't he? Maybe he's meditating, or maybe he's busy, or maybe he's on a journey, or perhaps he's sleeping. You need to wake him up. So they cried aloud. They cut themselves. They actually started cutting themselves, as was their custom. So this wasn't the first time this happened. With knives and lances till the blood gushed out of them. So it was, when midday was past, they prophesied to the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, but there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then you know the story of Elijah. He had them pour all this water on it. Then he said a prayer, and God sent the fire and burnt the offering, despite the fact there was all this water there. Now, when Elijah said this prayer, I imagine he was pretty emotional. But just because it's emotion doesn't make it right. I remember back when the church was going through some hard times, and I had a friend of mine who was a pastor who came to visit me where I was living, and he was getting turned around and coming up with buying into a lot of things that just weren't the truth. And I remember this so clearly. It was a Friday night. He was there for a couple of days, but I was sitting on the sofa where I lived, and he was in a chair, and he was talking about how he didn't believe the law was binding upon a Christian. And he was saying how he didn't think the holy days were binding upon a Christian. And he was saying these things, and I was getting, quite frustrated, but I was listening to him. But I remember two things he said that'll never leave my mind. Number one, he said, even though this, I am closer to God than I've ever been. And I remember thinking, I wish I could say I'm closer to God than I've ever been. Because there are times I'm doing, I feel like I need, a kick in the, backside. And then he said, and I want you to know that when I pray, I can pray better than I've ever prayed. And I thought, well, I wish I could say that, because sometimes when I pray, sometimes it's a struggle. Now, I don't know how many months was later, but it was probably it was less than 6 months later, he called me on a Sunday afternoon. And he called me and asked me a couple questions. And then he said, I want you to know, I'm so confused right now, I don't know what I believe about anything. Bottom line, he wasn't closer to God than he'd ever been. He wasn't praying to the true God easier than he ever prayed. He was losing that connection because he was leaving the truth. Now, he was very emotional that night, the way he was telling me this. He may have been very emotional but just because it's emotional doesn't make it true. Now, again, the truth of God is very emotional, but you can be real emotional and not have the truth. That was point number one. Point number two, and yes, I will finish on time. That's the most comforting thing I probably said. Yes. Okay. The Bible contrasts truth with ignorance. The Bible contrasts truth with ignorance. Now, if you don't know something, if you're ignorant of something, it doesn't make you a bad person necessarily. You just don't know. You just don't know. Think of people that don't know anything about God's way of life. Doesn't make them bad. It just means they don't know. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. Here's Paul. He's gone into Thessalonica, and when he went to Thessalonica, they chased him out. They chased him out, the Jews and some of the others. They just chased him out. And I don't go into all that. I could have to go to Acts for that. It would take too much time. But in verse 7 of chapter 1, 1 Thessalonians, verse 7. So you became examples to all in Macedonia and Achaia who believe. He's saying good things about the Thessalonican Christians. For from you the word of the Lord is sounded forth, Not only in Macedonia, now that was where Philippi was, Macedonia. So the book letter of the Philippians is a very encouraging book. And Acacia, that was where Corinth was, which is a pretty struggling church. But he says, you became examples to all. And from your word, the Lord has sounded forth, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place. Your faith toward God has gone out so that we don't need to say anything. Paul was just encouraging them. For they themselves declare concerning us what manner of entry we had to you, how you, Thessalonians, turned to God from idols to serve the living and the true God. The truth, what God really is, and to wait for His Son from heaven, whom He raised from the dead, even Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. The Thessalonians were being turned to the true God from what they were believing that wasn't the truth. Now, I'll turn to one other scripture. I'm going to turn to Galatians, because Galatians is a book that sometimes people get confused about. But notice what Paul said to the Galatians in chapter 4. And you're going to read verse 8, 9, and 10. Because people will say, well, Paul says, Galatians says, you don't need to keep the law. You don't need to keep the holy days. You don't need to keep the Sabbath. But Paul doesn't say that. He says you don't need to be circumcised. But notice what he says here. These are Galatians. Notice what he says about them. Verse 8, but then indeed, when you did not know God, they didn't even know God, these Galatians, when Paul came and preached the truth. You serve those things which by nature are not God's. So they were serving these things, but they weren't the true God, just like the Baal, prophets of Baal. It wasn't the true God. But now, after you have known God, here's a group of people that didn't even know God. Now they know God because they've heard the truth. So now after you've known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements which you desire again to be into bondage? They didn't even know God. So how would they have known about the truth of God till Paul came? You observe days and months and seasons and years. That little line, that little sentence, they'll say, well, you don't have to keep the holy days. You don't have to keep the Sabbath. They were keeping all these pagan holidays and pagan things. And they weren't the truth. And they were ignorant of the truth. So the Bible contrasts truth with ignorance. And number 3. So the first one, was truth is not just an emotion. Just because it's emotion doesn't make it true. Number 2, the Bible contrasts ignorance with the truth. If you don't know something, you're ignorant. I'm ignorant of Spanish. I took Spanish in high school. And I can say uno, dos, tres. That's about as far as I can get. I can't say como está usted, which means how are you? But then if they answer that, I'm lost. I say, oh, como está usted again. But I'm ignorant of it because I don't know it. And number 3, here's one we need to think about, is we're heading into tumultuous times. They're already here, but they're going to get worse. Those who do not have the truth often hate those that have the truth. That's not pleasant to have to talk about, but it's the way it is. John 15. Last night, right before Christ went to Pilate in John 18, when Pilate asked him, what's truth? But here's the night before. We probably read this most every Passover. Jesus was going on and speaking to his disciples, his apostles, I should say, in chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, a long, long discourse by Christ. But he says something here during it in verse 18 through 20 of John 15. He said to these apostles, if the world hates you, nobody wants to be hated. If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. They hated Jesus Christ. Well, they actually hated him so much they crucified him, did they not? If you were of the world would love its own. But yet, because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember what I said. A servant is not greater than his master. Well, who's our master? Jesus Christ and God the Father. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they'll also keep yours. And one other scripture over in Matthew 5. While we're turning there, I was thinking about a situation. This was years ago. Company I worked for, there were two girls or ladies that worked with me, and one's name, I won't say their name. I'm sure they may not even be alive for all I know. But one of them was not. I wouldn't say she was very religious at all, and the other one was very religious. Now, neither one was in our church, but I liked them both. I got along with them both fine. But one of them, I'll say her name was Maria, because that was her name. But so I guess that's a good one to use. Anyway, Maria, and then the other girl's name was Linda. So Linda was real religious and very moral, and Maria tended to lie a lot and try to see what she could get away with. And I was driving to account one time with Maria, and we're going somewhere, and she said, "Stan, what do you think about Linda?" And I said, "I think she's a real nice girl." And Maria said, "I hate her." I said, "Why do you hate her?" She said, "Because she's too nice." I thought, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, does it? It's the final scripture, in case you're concerned. Over in Matthew chapter 5, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, who was spoken by Jesus, in case you're wondering. At the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, well, not the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the end of the Beatitudes, in verse 11 and 12 of chapter 5, Christ said, "Blessed are you when they revile you, when they persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you, falsely for my sake." So if we are persecuted, nobody wants to be persecuted. I don't want to be persecuted. But if you have to go through some trials because you stand up for the truth, because you stand up for Jesus Christ and God the Father, Jesus said, rejoice. This is hard to even comprehend. He says, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So sometimes those that don't have the truth, and I have a couple other scriptures, but I won't turn there, just are against. It shines a light on, I guess, what they're acting like. So what are the purpose of these 3 points? Just something to think about. Because you and I, we have the truth of God. We have the Bible. We're human beings that have strengths and weaknesses, and, we're human beings. We're not perfect. And we're close to it. None of us are. But truth is not just an emotion. Just because it's an emotion doesn't make it true. The Bible contrasts ignorance with truth, and those who do not have the truth often hate those with the truth. Bottom line, we're heading to dangerous times. We're already in them. But it's not going to get any easier. But yet, Jesus Christ said, don't worry. If we stand up for the truth, we will be in the kingdom of God.